Hey, what's up, DIYers, Mike Boards, with the Mike Boards channel. Thank you for watching. We've got a mercruiser outdrive, and we are going to remove the upper unit, drive shaft, and U-joint assembly. Let's get started. All right, DIYers, at the workstation now. On the left-hand side is the upper unit resting on a stand, and on the far right-hand corner on that little white stand, you can see the lower unit. And in the event that you need guidance on separating the upper from the lower, definitely check out the link scrolling above. You may find it very helpful. However, to the upper unit, and as you can see with the U-joint assembly and shaft, we believe this is the original. That means it's about 30 years old. And unfortunately, the U-joint bellow gave way and allowed water into it, and over the months and years, rust began to gather. And we are going to remove this entire U-joint assembly and show you how easy it really can be with the right tools. And this step is optional when you are removing just the U-joint assembly. We are actually going to remove these 4 bolts and open up the case to look inside and look at the gears. Socket and ratchet in hand, 3/8 size, and I'm using this socket as shown here. And in the previous video, prior to separating the upper from the lower, I actually loosened up these 4 bolts. So it will look like they are easy to come off, but they were pretty firmly secured. And again, I loosened them prior to separating the upper from the lower because when it's still connected, it doesn't slide off the stand and you got better leverage to loosen up these bolts. And from here, again, all I'll do is remove all 4 bolts. All 4 bolts are removed, and I've set them up on the table. From here, grab a thick flathead screwdriver, and you are going to go to the side near the front, and your engine will have a little gap right here to stick a screwdriver in and separate the upper cap from the unit. And there is an open slot on each side. And set the screwdriver down. From here, you should just be able to carefully separate it by hand. We'll set that aside. What I did next was inserted the bolts in the same holes that they came out of. As I put everything back together, I want the same bolts going into the same holes. And quick glance at the inner gears. From here, we will direct our attention to the front portion. This is a retainer nut, and it secures the inner bearings and U-joint assembly in place on the engine. And some people can get away with just loosening up this retainer nut and shifting it out, and that will give you the opportunity to shift this entire U-joint assembly out of the engine. However, some may not have the clearance because of the U-joints and crossbars, and they will need to remove the clips that hold the crossbars on, hammer out the U-joint caps here that have the inner bearings, and shift this portion out. But we're going to go grab the tool and see if we can get away with not having to do that. Here is the wrench that removes the retainer nut, and some people can actually slide it up the shaft and over the actual U-joints and into place on the retainer nut. And check that out. That is a perfect fit. And if you do not have this tool and you are trying to loosen up this retainer nut by some other means, chances are you are going to destroy the retainer nut itself, and that will need to be replaced. Buying the right tool will make it convenient and will ensure you do not destroy that retainer nut. Next, I just grabbed a rubber mallet, and holding the retainer wrench in place, I'm going to just tap the top and hopefully loosen up this retainer nut. And that was very easy. Look at that. And from here, I'll just carefully continue to loosen it. And again, hopefully I have clearance. I don't know 100% yet, but hopefully I do. And it really looks like I do. So that saves me a lot of time by not having to remove these inner C-clips that lock the crossbars in place on the U-joint assembly. Use the wrench to turn it several times, and from here I can just spin it by hand. And check that out. The retainer nut is completely loosened up and separated from the inner portion of the engine. I've now repositioned the stand, and I've got a piece of cardboard down because as you pull this entire U-joint assembly out with the bearing connected to it, it's going to leak some oil. From here, go ahead and lift up the U-joint and kind of slide that retainer nut forward, and we are going to insert the wrench as shown here to protect the back side or opening slash surface of where the bearing slides into. And next, I'm going to grab a pry bar and go deep inside the U-joint where I can use this portion of the wrench as leverage. And the last thing I want to do is allow this pry bar to touch that retainer nut. I want to protect this retainer nut and just kind of give it some friendly jolts. Check that out. And a quick recap, as I did this, I inserted this portion of the wrench right here to protect the surface here of the engine. And the inner bearing is ever so slightly positioned behind the face of the opening. So just a couple friendly jolts and you loosen up the bearing and it slides forward flush with the opening. Go ahead and remove these and pull it out by hand. Here it is up on the workbench, and again, just very important not to damage this retainer nut. We do want to keep that and reuse it when we rebuild everything. And back to the engine, what we're going to do is clean up all the oil in the inner portion here. And once we do that, deep in here you've got a couple additional parts, and as you can see here, there's two parts. One is a shim, one is a spacer. So you want to make sure you do not mix these up when reinstalling the new ones. What I did next was rest the shim and spacer over the gear, so I know exactly which way it goes back on when reassembling everything. Back to the upper unit, I spent about a minute and wiped out all the oil, and I will need to clean up the inside there, probably buff it out. As you can see, just a little bit of indication of rubbing there, and you want to clean that out prior to putting everything back together. DIYers, that's it. Hopefully this helps. I just wanted to show you how to remove that entire U-joint assembly. From here, do us a favor, below the video, you will see that thumbs up icon. Click on that, like the video, subscribe to the channel. Definitely ring your YouTube bell. That would be very helpful to us. We'd really appreciate it. Thanks again for watching. And in the event that you want guidance on continuing with the rebuild, definitely check out the link scrolling above. We'll pick up right where we left off and remove that vertical gear, the internal seals, and rebuild the new assembly. And real quick, before I forget, to remove this retainer nut, you got two options. Number one, removing the U-joint crossbars, as we mentioned earlier. And now that you have the assembly out, it's a lot more friendly to remove these. You can basically just put this in a vise and remove it. And the second option is basically coming back to the preload nut and washer, removing that, pulling the gear off, and shifting the entire bearing off. At that point, you can shift the retainer nut off and reuse it. With that said, here's a closer look of the nut and washer. That is a preload washer, as I just mentioned, and once you loosen that up, they have to be replaced, both the washer and nut in most cases. The washer for sure, the nut, maybe you can keep it, but we recommend replacing it. And if you do this, make sure you follow the directions on properly preloading this nut and washer back together when you are reassembling it.